Greetings, my loyal listeners, and any newcomers joining us for the first time. We're happy to have you. This is the third episode of Calling It Like It Is, my podcast, although some of you might say mercifully this is going to be a normal-sized podcast. I certainly got a bit carried away and spoke for over 2 hours last time, but I would submit to you listeners that it was 2 hours of quality, in-depth, thoughtful, and substantive discussion on some pretty deep stuff. Please feel free to check it out. But now we're back to our normal-sized podcast, and my name is Brian Frydenborg. I am an international affairs, development, and public policy professional, as well as a freelance writer, journalist, and historian. And for those of you who aren't new, I hope you can tell that I'm trying to enunciate a bit more and hone my radio personality / podcast skills here. I hope you will appreciate the efforts. Now today we've got some pretty heavy stuff. We're going to be talking about the politics of torture and of prosecuting former senior government officials. I'm going to be surprising a lot of you on this topic, I believe. And I want to begin with a quote. I'm going to change a few things about this quote, and I'll explain why, because this is going to be the launch for the whole prism, or a big part of the prism through which I'm looking at these issues. Okay, to begin the quote, slightly abridged. The pattern of routine partisanship and factionalism, and as a result of all other vicious practices, had arisen in America. It was the result of peace and an abundance of those things that mortals consider most important. I say this because before the destruction of the Soviet Union, mutual consideration and restraint between the people and the Senate characterized the government. Among the citizens, there was no struggle for glory or domination. Fear of a foreign enemy preserved good political practices. But when that fear was no longer on their minds, self-indulgence and arrogance, attitudes that prosperity loves, took over. As a result, the tranquility they had longed for in difficult times proved, when they got it, to be more cruel and bitter than adversity. For the elites twisted their dignity, and the people twisted their liberty towards their desires. Every man acted on his own behalf, stealing, robbing, plundering. In this way, all political life was torn apart between two parties, and the republic, which had been our common ground, was mutilated. But the elites, as a faction, had more power. Less potent, the people's strength was dissipated and dispersed among the multitude. A few men controlled military and domestic affairs. The same men held the treasury, the provinces, political offices, honors, and other benefits. The people were oppressed by military service and by poverty. The spoils of war were ravaged by the generals and their friends. And so, joined with power, greed without moderation or measure invaded, polluted, and devastated everything, considered nothing valuable or sacred, until it brought about its own collapse. For as soon as men were found among the elites who put true glory above unjust power, the state began to tremble, and civil strife began to rise up like an earthquake. End quote. Now, I deliberately read that so that you would think I'm talking about the United States, but I'm not. The historian that wrote this was Sallust, a contemporary of Julius Caesar and one of the great Roman historians, and this is taken from the Jugurthine War. And if we substitute the Soviet Union with Carthage and the aristocracy for the elites, and realize that we're talking about the Roman Senate, there are a lot of similarities. And the reason I want to talk about Rome is because what became common practice in the final century, and especially the final decades of the democratic republic that Rome had, what became common practice shortly before that republic fell and became a military dictatorship that would rise to become the Roman Empire with the emperors in charge and not elected officials. And this is after over 4.5 centuries of having a democratic republic. These practices are what I am going to be cautioning against, because it doesn't end well for Rome, and I strongly believe it won't end well for us. Now, just like the United States, Rome pretty quickly came to be the dominant power compared to anybody that it interacted with physically. China was doing pretty well, but there was just not really direct contact between the two. They were just so far apart. But Rome truly dominated the entire Mediterranean, Britain, large parts of the Middle East, parts of Germany, and inland Europe. So, and that was a pretty impressive feat. Most of that territory was not conquered under the emperors, it was conquered under the elected officials of the Roman Republic. And Sallust, the historian here, just as, say, Republicans, when they talk about like the 1950s, Sallust does idealize the prior era a bit, but there's no mistaking and no doubt that things got dramatically worse once Rome became unchallenged, and the amount of money that they controlled and the spoils and the benefits of the senior office holders grew, and it was more about what you could get as a public servant than actually serving the public. Does any of this sound familiar? That's when they really started having problems. And the partisanship, because the stakes became so much greater, and also because politicians, to campaign and to win office, had to spend so much money and go in bed with so many large, powerful entities, including multinational corporations. Yes, the Romans had them. They were called publicani. And because the stakes in terms of the risks grew so much more along with those. With so much more to gain, people were ready to play a lot dirtier, and the pitfalls could be much worse. Ruinous debt wasn't even the half of it. What happened is things were becoming so corrupt in the court system and in the provinces that the senior officials governed, so horribly corrupt. You actually have one man who made a name of himself, a bit of a bridge between the old school aristocrats and the people. He himself was a new school aristocrat, and the old school guys didn't let him forget that. I'm talking about Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero. He made a name for himself prosecuting a corrupt governor when standard practice had been the juries themselves were composed almost entirely of the people who had been the governor's peers, and they helped each other out, and there's no justice and no guilty verdicts as a general practice. And Cicero very, very eloquently actually makes this point perfectly. So this is Cicero as the prosecution in this trial. Quote, "This is a trial in which you will be passing verdict on the defendants, but the Roman people will also be passing verdict on you. This case will determine whether it is possible, when a jury consists of senators, for a very guilty but very rich man to be convicted. Moreover, this is a defendant who has only two characteristics: extreme guilt and immense wealth. So if he is acquitted, no other conclusion could possibly be drawn except for the least favorable one. End quote. So think about that. He's basically telling his own governing elite, you're on trial. And it was not a trial that the elite as a class were rising to the challenge of. It was not one they passed as a class. And this was a huge problem. And it's really the number one reason the Republic fell is that the governing elite class lost their sense of public service as a class. There were individuals who tried hard, but there was too much corruption in the system. The system was rotten in terms of both the people who ran it and the institutions that ran it during the final decades of the Republic. And what would happen is, as I mentioned, the stakes had risen, the partisanship had risen, the corruption had risen. So you basically had the court system in general, a part of the court system which had been set up to police and restrain the governing elite's excessive behavior. This part of the court system became a personal political plaything between rivals, and prosecution, or the threat of prosecution, became very real for many people who were just honestly trying to do their jobs, but also for many people who were corrupt, and yet it wasn't because they were corrupt, it was simply political revenge. And in the beginning, these courts were incredibly important because there was a triumph just in their establishment, because there had been really no accountability for the governing elites in the provinces. And this caused Rome tremendous problems, major wars in the provinces that could have been avoided if the governing elites had been much less corrupt and stealing and plundering their provinces less. There's only so much people can take, and these wars were actually devastating for Rome and very bloody and very difficult, and took many years. And they were in many ways brought on by the greed and abuse of the governing class. But the point of those courts did not survive in the practice. This is Cicero again. Quote, I said I thought that there would come a time when foreign peoples would send delegations to Rome to request that the extortion law and this court would be abolished. For if there were no courts, they believed that each governor would only carry off enough for himself and his children. With the courts as they are now, on the other hand, they reckon each governor carries away enough for himself, his advocates, his supporters, the president of the court, that's like a judge, and the jurors, in other words, an infinite amount. Their conclusion is that they are capable of satisfying the avarice of one greedy individual, but incapable of subsidizing a man's guilty acquittal. How remarkable are our courts, and how glorious the reputation of our order, he's talking about the senators here, when the allies of the Roman people hope for the abolition of the extortion court, which our ancestors established for their benefit. End quote. So anyway, we are seeing here how the courts were very much being twisted away from something that was their original purpose. And as I mentioned, the elites started to really use them to go after each other for political reasons, purely political reasons. Even if there was corruption involved, either the other person engaging in the prosecution had done the same thing, or the person was innocent. It was, or even if they weren't innocent, it had nothing to do with that. It was about personal rivalries. And this came to be the looming situation between Caesar and Cato leading the Senate, Marcus Porcius Cato and Julius Caesar here, also with Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, having just been whittled away from his alliance with Caesar and now kind of being in league with the senatorial elites. Caesar's fighting his war in Gaul, in the famous Gallic War, and for years, this guy Cato and the other senatorial elites had done everything they could to oppose everything Caesar tried to do. At this time, the senatorial elites really cared only about themselves, preserving the tradition of the Republic, which made sense in many ways, but also preserved their power at the expense of everybody else. And they didn't want to do anything to help the people. And they weren't doing anything to help the people. I mean, what you had is major problems here. You had wars sparked because of this, because of the mistreatment of provincials who rose up and gave Rome many problems. You had riots and many poor people in Rome, destabilizing the city and the surrounding area. You had all these veterans from bloody wars who came back after they were soldiers and had nothing. And they weren't even given land to farm, to settle down. And some of them became involved in all the street violence and these mobs and riots because they know how to fight and the state wasn't responding to their needs. And this is a little bit about what I talked about last time with the Palestinians, with African Americans. So oftentimes it was true, really, that only that threat of violence from the quote-unquote mob, from the people, that brought any type of compromise from the leading senatorial elites led by Cato. Caesar, I believe, at least, he did care about the people. If you look at his career, he really put the people first. Himself too, but also the people. And he viewed himself as one of the only people who really stuck up for them. So in many ways, he had to put himself first if he was really going to try and work on the people's behalf. But at the same time, Julius Caesar, a man with his ego and abilities, had no problem falling for that logic, and there is a logic to it, of putting himself first to be able to put the people first. And even when he later assumed dictatorial powers, much of what he did was very beneficial for the Republic and for the people, although you can argue it wasn't a republic anymore at that point. But anyway, Caesar's fighting his war in Gaul, and his term of office is about to be up. And when you're in office, you're safe from prosecution. The second you're out of office, you can be dragged into the courts. And usually the punishment was exile, but it could be worse. It could be death. And Caesar has done a lot for the Republic at this point. And his enemies are threatening to prosecute him for treason. And it's incredibly insulting to a man who has given his life to public service and done a lot for Rome and for the people. And he's the people's champion. And so obviously the people don't like hearing this stuff about prosecuting Caesar. And basically, the senatorial elites led by Cato left Caesar with two options: face certain prosecution if he stepped down from his term of office. Caesar tried to work out a compromise, to see some kind of smaller office where he would still be safe from prosecution, but he would accept a step down along with his rival Pompey Magnus, that they would both kind of de-escalate and both accept lesser roles. And that could certainly have worked and avoided bloodshed. But they refused that compromise, and they offered him a choice between certain prosecution and at best exile, because there's no way these courts would have uh, not been stacked with Caesar's opponents, or war. They've literally left him no other option between being declared an enemy of the state that he served his whole life, or we go fight. And with Caesar, if you think this is totally selfish, it's hard for me to believe that, because at this point, these people had really been abusing their power for decades, and there was so much that needed to be done and so many problems that were not being addressed by these conservative elites. I'm sure Caesar could have easily rationalized, this is wrong for both me and for Rome if I stepped aside. And it's a toll. And this is a culture that very much values dignity and honor. This is not like the US where you can get in some corruption scandal. People don't even really care anymore. They take the money and they're happy. No, with Rome, honor and dignity was everything for many of these elites. And so you can imagine Americans being okay with that, but for a Roman to accept that shame and disgrace, and it wasn't just you, your family name would be, if you had a son or any relatives and they wanted to get back involved in government, they would face enormous challenges with a stain on a family name like that. So I'm bringing all this up because it didn't start out as a choice between civil war and prosecution. And I'm not suggesting that the United States today is anywhere near that. But we do need to think about this, because with Rome, as I was just saying, it didn't start with them, with those stakes and at that level. But once the prosecution of people for anything other than blatant, completely undebatable corruption, stuff like that, as was the case with Cicero, and the famous trial that he was the prosecutor in against this governor Varus, and I quoted from some of his courtroom speeches there. And Cicero was able to win the conviction on that. Okay, but again, even Cicero's situation was the exception. Usually there weren't. But anyway, it didn't start off like that. And even when they were being abused, it wasn't this supermassive political vendetta tool. But it did become that. And it didn't happen right away. And it took time. And what makes me nervous now, okay, I love the New York Times. I think it's the greatest newspaper in the world, especially for the reporting. I don't always agree with the editorials. I don't always agree with the op-ed columnists. I mean, they have conservative and liberal op-ed columnists. I mean, not Tea Party raving mad conservative. You got David Brooks and Ross Douthat, and the Republican Party needs to have a bigger tent and a bigger notion of what being conservative means if they're going to consider that those, call those people sellouts or whatever. They're principled, thoughtful conservatives. And there's plenty of liberals, obviously. There's a liberal slant to the editorial side and the opinion page side in general, not always, and there's always exceptions. But the reporting's amazing on the Times. But they just had an editorial, the New York Times, basically saying we should prosecute Dick Cheney and other officials for what they did with this torture stuff. And I'm sympathetic to that. I really am. I'm really sympathetic. I hate what the Bush administration did with creating this kind of loose legal culture where a lot of people could have been said to have been subtly or inadvertently encouraged, perhaps deliberately and explicitly, although I'm not quite sure it gets there. But they played fast and loose with the rules, with the way the United States had traditionally, as a matter of policy, treated prisoners. Now, we've always had abuses. There were abuses in the colonial era when we captured Native Americans. There were abuses in the Revolutionary War. Tarring and feathering must have been an awful experience for some of those British officials, okay? There were examples of horrible mistreatment during the Civil War, where Confederates executed black prisoners, and prisons of Andersonville, and I think one was in Elmira, New York. On both sides, some of them were just atrocious, not horribly far off from concentration camps, if not in their purpose, but their conditions. Now, and this went, World War I, World War II. There were abuses. There have been abuses in Iraq and Afghanistan where soldiers have tortured and mistreated and killed civilians and prisoners and whatever, whatever you want to call them, but not as a matter of policy. And what was so incredibly stupid about the Bush administration is that they codified it. They publicly said, we're going to do this stuff that there's disagreement on. And there's torture and there's torture. There's a great line from one of my favorite shows, Rome. This character Titus Pillow says, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm pretty close. He's like, well, there's lies and there's lies. Well, there's torture and there's torture. And waterboarding's terrible. It's not cutting people's arms off and sticking sharp objects up their anus and cutting their tongue out, and that's not to diminish the significance of this. I was horrified and disgusted by Abu Ghraib, by our misconduct in general, by us allowing these practices at all, whether officially or unofficially. I don't think we need to be doing that. It just there's a lot of studies here. Israel's been through this. It just is shown to be ineffective. You don't get good intelligence. You often get people making stuff up just so that the torture will lie. The Senate report, which came out recently, I encourage everyone to look at it. It's a wonderful document. It's one of the best things this country's done in a long time. We did something really, really horrible, and then we wrote an honest accounting of what happened that makes a lot of people look bad. And one of the things that makes this so great is that it's very much a bipartisan document and not a political document in the purest or in a more pure sense. It's a policy document, a policy review done by a committee, and with the Senate almost divided, the committee was either even or almost exactly even between Republicans and Democrats. And of the 7 Republicans on the committee, 3 of them, including Susan Collins of Maine, one of the last moderate Republican senators out there, she voted along with 2 of her Republican colleagues. So almost half of the Republicans on the committee voted to declassify this report and make it publicly available. John McCain, who ran against Obama as a Republican in 2008, praised the release of the report. But honestly, and this is to the shame of the Republican Party, very few Republicans have come out and supported the release of this document to the public, letting people know what happened and why. And again, this goes back to my previous podcast where I talked about the 2 parties and how there are differences. And let it be known and let it be remembered that very few Republicans wanted anything about this to come out to the public. They wanted to sweep it under the rug. But some brave Republicans like John McCain and Susan Collins of Maine and a few others, a very few others, did support this. Even if they didn't completely agree with some aspects of it, they felt that the American public had the right to know, and they had the right to make up their own minds and to have the information be out there. So that's another reason why it's great, by the way. So this bipartisan report was released. It seems to be very much an honest investigation into something we did wrong by our own government, which is great. And we let the public see the results. And they're not pretty. And how many countries would do that, I mean, it's awful that we were doing that at all, but pretty much every country tortures. Maybe not some in Western Europe, but outside of that, you can tell me China, Russia aren't torturing. Egypt, Israel does. Um, not too long ago, the Europeans had no problem torturing their colonials. And we're talking a few decades ago, not 100 years ago. So everyone's getting on us about this, but we also still are better than the vast majority of countries in terms of how they treat their captured. That just because we're better doesn't mean we should not still be ashamed of when we fall short of our ideal. It's not enough to just look at other people and say, oh, well, we're better than them. We should acknowledge and get credit for being better, but when we are not right anyway, we should still also be criticized. So I was ashamed. I was very furious. And I encourage all of you to watch The Unknown Known, which is Errol Morris's documentary about Rumsfeld. He did one about McNamara, Robert McNamara, our Secretary of Defense during both the Cuban Missile Crisis when he was awesome and Vietnam when he was not so much awesome. And you see a man tortured with himself who for many years kept saying, yeah, I did the right thing, and then you realize, you know what, I didn't, and it was wrong. Donald Rumsfeld, our more recent Secretary of Defense before Gates, and who was just awful for several years with Bush, President George W. Bush. He started off not doing okay, actually, pretty good in some ways, but then things got terrible under him. And you watch this film, and I'm being completely honest here, I cannot stand Donald Rumsfeld. However, he's clearly a man who loves his country, who is doing what he thought was best. He really had to contort himself, but he did rationalize it to himself, and it's clear he believes his own BS. And he made a lot of mistakes. And he created this culture and with this approach and these words where maybe we're allowing it for some exceptions here, but I'm not totally clear on this or that. And apparently a few times, things like waterboarding and other techniques, rough techniques, very rough techniques, nothing like what our enemies would do to people, but which would be much worse, but still some pretty bad stuff have loud music blasting at you for hours and hours and hours and being forced into something like a box and being roughed up and just not cool stuff. And they were authorized under very specific conditions and very specific situations. But that opened a can of worms. And these techniques migrated. And, there wasn't this active supervision and attempt to really clarify and codify. And maybe there was a little bit of a nod, wink, wink. I don't know. I mean, that's how things get done a lot of time. But for me, this man, Rumsfeld, made some terrible mistakes of judgment. Okay? And they certainly went too far. And I would consider what they're doing torture. But legalese is an interesting world where the way you normally think of things aren't always the same. And there actually is a legal argument that some of this stuff that there's a gray area. And for me, I say stay the hell away from the gray area. Stay away from it. Unless we've got a 24 situation with a ticking nuclear bomb and a guy tied up and we're interrogating him then. And we've never had anything like that, okay? This isn't 24. This is the real world. I'm not saying there's never, ever a reason to bend the rules a bit, but I just don't think we're facing that kind of a threat, okay? Stay away from the gray area. Stay away from it. Don't rationalize it. Don't explore it. Do not get creative and interested in that gray area. Don't do it. Do not do it. And these guys really, and I have some sympathy for them. You're the President of the United States and the Twin Towers get knocked down and the Pentagon gets hit and you don't know what else is coming and you have your George W. Bush kind of, you're reading My Pet Goat and all of a sudden this is what you're dealing with. And for them, they were terrified to a degree. I think they were all terrified. They realized they were caught off guard. They were totally caught off guard. They were caught with their pants down. And they kind of freaked out. And they wanted to have every option available to defend the American people. They took their job very, very seriously. I think they were scarred and felt horrible after that attack, after 9/11. And so they went too far and were too zealous, too open-minded in exploring how they can defend and protect the interests of the United States. And we're talking about the whole gamut, whether it's thinking that invading a country like Iraq and creating democracy in America's image there would be the solution to the problems of the Middle East and our own security problems. That was too creative. And so it's this enhanced interrogation techniques, quote unquote, which is what they term them. We don't need enhanced interrogation techniques. We already have good interrogation techniques. And the report disputes that there was any specific life-saving intelligence that came from this stuff, these type of techniques. Other people have offered counter-arguments without any evidence. You can look this up. I've been very fastidious in looking this up. There is no specific piece of evidence that's been offered in terms of specific information coming from the use of these techniques, demonstrating that such information was used and saved lives. There is no firm evidence or claims by participants of that's not disputed by credible participants in these proceedings. All right, so look, I can't stand Rumsfeld, can't stand Cheney, can't stand Bush, although I see George W. Bush as a bit more of a tragic figure who was let down by the people around him, but who also should never have been in that office or position to begin with. But, you know, Rumsfeld, you got to watch this Unknown Known. It's riveting because this is a man who really lives in his own world, but he was doing the best job he could. He was appointed this position. He was serving. He was doing the best job he could, which was not good enough, and he was the wrong man for the job. And I say the best job he could because his glaring deficiencies, his myopia, his inability to see the larger picture, his ability to rationalize way too many things that should not have been rationalized is remarkable and astounding. You can tell from Errol Morris when he's interviewing him, from his voice, he just sometimes cannot believe the words that are coming out of this guy's mouth. And the very end is amazing because we're quoting a quote Rumsfeld made often in his tenure as Secretary of Defense about known unknowns, unknown knowns, known knowns, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. You've got to see it. And Errol Morris repeats his quote to him and then asks him a question about it. And at the very end, this is how the documentary is, Rumsfeld basically says, you know, I kind of like it this new way. I'm going to say this differently now. I like it this way instead. Not even addressing the concern and the question that Errol Morris raised in the original statement. You know, it's just amazing. And what I'll say is these people were sick, they were delusional, but they were patriots. They had America's best interests at heart, but they were wrong. They made the wrong call and the wrong decision. And this is the point I really need to drive home here. We're responsible. We reelected these guys. There was evidence, there were signs that this kind of stuff was going on. There's not a lot in that torture memo report from the Senate that should be horribly surprising. We reelected these guys. We didn't ask the questions. We didn't hold them accountable. We reelected them. And then the people in Congress that we elected in general did not hold them accountable. It's Congress's job to investigate this kind of stuff. We weren't demanding that they did. Some of us were, but not enough to make a difference. And I can tell you, I interned in the Senate. When people call in and say, I want this, I live in your district, they pay attention. It's actually not that hard to get people to do stuff that you want to. You just have to have a bunch of people say the same stuff, and all of a sudden, this guy wants to be reelected. Oh my God, if he doesn't do what these people are saying, or pay attention to them or acknowledge them, he might not get reelected. He better change his behavior. I'm telling you, that's how the system often works in DC. When people don't pay attention, they're not engaged, and they're not doing their duty as citizens. So we empowered this administration after its character was clear to us. We weren't sure in 2000 when we voted. This man talked about having a humble foreign policy. Yeah, okay, great. Well, and 9/11 changed that, to be fair, but still, we empowered these guys, okay, number one. All right, and then the other major point I want to drive here is that, again, these guys were doing the best job they could. They shouldn't have been in power, though, but we empowered them. We reelected Bush and Cheney. Cheney was on the ticket. Rumsfeld was already Secretary of Defense. Iraq was already downward spiraling. We empowered these guys. Okay? And now we feel bad about what happened when we should have expected this because this is what we voted for. Whether we knew it or not, and it was our responsibility to know. Whether we knew it or not, we chose this. And it's our job to know what we're choosing when we vote. We can't always know, but especially on re-electing a president we've already had, we should have known. We should have known better. John Kerry would have been an infinitely better president. I'm sorry, he just would have in so many ways. But anyway, this gets to my conclusion here now. Because these are honest public servants who were horrible at their job for the most part and who made the calls as they best saw fit with the information they had. We weren't in their shoes. We can still judge them to a degree, and we should. We need to. It's our job to do that. But I hate to say it, and I know people are going to hate me for saying this, but or at least hate what I say. Please don't hate me. I'm likable. I'm very likable and single, by the way. Anyway, but I consider them honest mistakes. Inexcusable mistakes born of gross, almost criminal negligence if they were doing something else with their lives. It would be criminal negligence, or certainly fireable negligence. But in this case, I just don't think it's fair. In some ways, they deserve it, but these are very difficult positions. We have to, in some ways, treat with kid gloves our senior officials once they're out of office. And, for example, in office, the impeachment of Clinton, unbelievably ridiculous. Just stupid, awful, terrible. Should never have happened. Andrew Johnson, though, should have been impeached after the Civil War, but that's a whole other thing. But anyway, but Clinton was in office. That was one thing. But when we start saying the former presidents and former secretaries of defense and vice presidents, because there's a lot of stuff we don't know about that then becomes public knowledge when stuff becomes declassified, like this report, like the Senate intelligence report, okay? And JFK with the Bay of Pigs. Let's say he had survived, and we found out he was having sex with all these women, including Marilyn Monroe, treating Jackie like just terribly, being reckless. Let's say all that stuff about the Bay of Pigs came out in like 1975, and JFK is a retired president. Hasn't been assassinated. It's a better case. Or maybe not, I wouldn't say a better case, but you could make a comparable case to, maybe JFK should be prosecuted. It's an illegal war and this and that. And we were authorizing, Bobby Kennedy authorized terrorism in Cuba. Try and make it look like it was not Americans, but we authorized that. The stuff we did during the Cold War, Democrats and Republicans. Jimmy Carter has a great record on human rights, but then, look at his involvement with the Sandinistas in Central America. And I love Jimmy Carter. I mean, he's a very flawed man, made a lot of mistakes, but good guy. I can't stand Ronald Reagan. I can't stand his presidency. But you could really prosecute any president and any senior official for some of the stuff that goes on. You really could. And I have to disagree with the New York Times here. You look at Cheney and Rumsfeld and Bush, and we should shame them in a sense where we completely discredit their policies and make it clear this is not an option and it's not a precedent. We officially, bipartisanly condemn these types of techniques in interrogating people, okay? We need to do that. However, I think when we go past that point and try to start locking people up and prosecuting former heads of state and their senior officials, maybe they deserve it. Maybe they do deserve it. I'm sympathetic to that. I'm not going to say that they don't deserve it, but I'm also not ready to say that they do. Very hard job, very tough times we were in, and they were not the right people for the job. They weren't equipped. They didn't have the right capabilities. They didn't have the right mindset or worldview. But if we're going to prosecute them for that, we need to prosecute ourselves because we're the ones who elected them. Okay? Seriously. So, Obama never gets credit for anything in the media that are really his greatest achievements. I really don't think he does, other than the Bin Laden hit, okay? Because he is saying what I'm saying. He's saying, let's look forward and not backward. He is against prosecuting his predecessor or his predecessor's vice president or senior secretaries of defense. He's against it. He's said he's against it. He's not going to engage in that. And that is, just like Gerald Ford, it's a class act. It's a lonely office. It's not easy being president. It wasn't easy for Bush. Goodness knows it wasn't easy for him. It's not easy for Obama. You know, this would open up a can of worms, as we have not done this. This, in our history, this would open up a can of worms like in Rome, when, and in this case, I would say the motivations are fairly good, but you can't promise that that will be the case the next time. And I think about this extremist Republican Party driven by the Tea Party, and I discussed this plenty in my last podcast. I think about this, and I shudder with horror when I think about such prosecutions becoming more common practice. Because let's go back to Caesar now. All of a sudden, when you're in office and you know you're going to face prosecution or likely to face prosecution from your allies, it changes how you do things. You're more apt to cover up. You're more apt to abuse your power to protect yourself because you need to. Because the partisanship gets so bad that it's almost automatic that you're going to be prosecuted by your enemies. You need to bribe people. You need to stow money away. You need to be corrupt. And it makes the system even worse. It makes you prone and ready to more extreme action because the stakes are higher. When the stakes are higher, the response gets higher. And I just don't see it as a good path for our republic to go down, to start prosecuting former officials who made the best calls they saw fit in an honest attempt to preserve American interests. It's not like they were like, yay, we get to torture people. I love to torture. It's not like Dick Cheney sits in his basement and finds small rodents and waterboards them and masturbates to that. That's not what happens. I don't like Dick Cheney, but let's try and be fair, even if they weren't. And let's keep our own interests in mind and our own responsibility as well. That this opens up an ugly path that almost certainly would be built upon and used to ruin our politics even more than it has. And if you look at the precedent of Rome, it's not very different in this situation, and it doesn't end well. We don't need to start on that path. I promise you, it would not start or end with Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, and others. And I promise you that these Republicans, if they ever had the power, there's a lot of people that they would go after that I think many of us would not agree with. And the Democrats may very well respond and degenerate and do the same type of partisan thing. Because I don't think this is partisan. I do think that Democrats and liberals and others like John McCain are rightfully upset and disgraced and ashamed of what has happened and are angry and want someone to pay, and that's normal. I don't think it's a witch hunt, but I just don't see this helping us. It would tear the country apart. It would tear the country apart. It would dramatically increase partisanship, bitterness between both sides. It would get ugly. If you think things are bad now, it would get ugly. And we don't need that. And it really scares me what would happen if we started with this. So that's that. Thank you for joining us this week. I'm sure many of you will be surprised at that. But that, again, and this goes back again to last episode where I talked about not having an ideology and not being a partisan. Do not prosecute